Well, I couldn't have asked for a nicer intro than Arnie gave to set up my conversation. So good morning, everyone. My name is Sara Vorpahl. I'm a manager at the Washington State Energy Office, working on federal energy policy and strategic alignment with state energy goals. So today I'm just going to talk very briefly about what that role is, but in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, but then really dive into a program that was recently released in terms of just notice of information from DOE, from the Federal Department of Energy on transmission. So hopefully it'll just get us to the ask that Rob had, which is, thinking about what we need for Washington. So that's where I'll end up today, kind of putting it forward some of my own recommendations that really dovetail nicely with what Arnie was saying, hopefully. Okay. And there we go. So coming from the Department of Commerce, where we administer a lot of money to a lot of different things, probably y'all know that by now. So just a quick dance through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, IIJA, BIL, you might have heard all these things. Passed in November of 21, just a historic investment in core infrastructure, not only for transmission and energy and grid, but a lot of other things as well. There's a lot of focus as well on a particular rural investment and dedicating major money to real projects. A good note for any ARA survivors out there. When ARA was about getting money, the American Reinvestment Act that was passed in the Obama administration, that was about getting money out as quickly as possible to reinvigorate the economy after the crash. The IIJA is about building infrastructure and long-term thinking, theoretically. And so all the buckets of money that we're talking about are not one-time funding. They're set up as reoccurring equal amounts of funding over 5 fiscal years, 22 to 26. So it's just a whole different kind of approach. And I just want to kind of caveat that at the beginning because, it'll be very overwhelming, all the opportunity. But the good news is that we hopefully have some time to do some planning to really take advantage in the later years of these programs. So how much are we talking about? Of the almost $1 trillion, about half, or 550 billion, is for new investments. And so as you can see, it's not just for energy and grid, it's for broadband, water. The majority is for transportation, resiliency efforts, climate mitigation, and water infrastructure. So if we zoom in on that energy and power, that's where we're going to talk about the transmission program today. Just a real quick note, though, on my role, because it is new, and some of you I may know from my previous role in the State Energy Office, working as an energy specialist and working on CETA. This role is really about thinking about how we strategize on all this money. So here is the idealized process of how this works. Isn't it beautiful? There's clean, simple boxes, and we can figure this all out in a really nice, straightforward way. So we identify some opportunities. We really want to make sure that as we're identifying those federal funding opportunities, we're thinking about how to coordinate across agencies, incorporate a meaningful equity analysis that's in line with state law, as well as Justice 40 initiative at the federal level, and ensuring travel outreach and coordination. Once we kind of do iterative process of that, putting teams together to actually go after these funds. A lot of these things are starting out as requests for information, so writing responses for that, planning for applications, and then eventually applying. So that is hopefully how my job will run. But then also, this is what the reality looks like. This is the current map of all federal opportunities, most of which are related to IIJA. So you can see it's a lot. We're talking about a lot of money, a lot of new programs, and brand new programs that DOE has never done, and a lot of opportunity, though. So don't worry about taking all this in right now. I'll make sure this information gets to you in case you want to go through it, and you can check out some of the DOE websites. But just to give you a sense of what we're talking about. So the transmission facilitation program here at the top right is but one of many that include battery manufacturing. There's a new interconnection and innovation exchange to think about how to streamline interconnection processes for projects, renewable energy projects, hydrogen hubs, electric vehicles, et cetera. Okay, so now we can burrow in a little bit more. I will not purport to be an expert on transmission or this program. I am just learning as you are. So a lot of my job is reading a lot of DOE websites and going to a lot of webinars. So I shamelessly stole all of these lovely slides from a DOE webinar that happened last week on this program. So I'm going to walk through these to present the information here because I think amplifying it is important. The more comprehensive set, as well as a recording and frequently asked questions, are available on DOE's website. So I will, answer what I know based on what I've, learned, but I also encourage folks to take a deeper dive into the information that's on the website. And again, all of that will be sent. I'll have to make sure Ross has all that information for you. So highlighted in yellow, you see the transmission facilitation program. And as you can see, it's nestled in a whole lot of other work around transmission that DOE is doing. So, in addition to the financing tools, there's transmission planning, including a new kind of revamped transmission needs study that will identify these transmission corridors in the United States. And that is being kind of led by a bunch of people, by a work group. And I believe Annalise from the governor's office is participating in that work group. So Washington's at the table, good to know. And then there will be some other targeted planning studies as well. They're also, I think generally, DOE is really trying to understand how to work with communities to do infrastructure planning. And so there's this engagement and collaboration for all the kind of stakeholders you see at the left here, that they're really trying to better understand, how do you identify benefits? What does that mean to communities? How do you work with communities to get these jobs done, states and tribes as well? So kind of more information about how to do that. Justice 40 initiative also really puts that down as a mandate in a lot of this funding. Again, streamlining for the permitting process. So things that really track with a lot of the conversations in the states, thinking about, how they do permitting for the federal agencies. And then still thinking about innovation. Of course, they are DOE, they have an office of, science, and they do a lot of research. So thinking about what next generation technologies look like. Here in the middle, the financing tools, we've got the TCP, which I'll talk about a little bit more in depth. And then we have a suite of grid resilience programs. The third bullet, the grid resilience grants for states, is a formula program that will be run out of Commerce, and it'll be formula funds of about 11.7 million a year for Washington, every year for 5 years to support grid resilience. More to come on that. And then existing loan guarantee programs. And again, check those out. The Loans Program Office, which has existed for a while, that got reinvigorated in IIJA, as well as the WAPA Transmission Infrastructure Program. I don't know much about that program, but I'll send a link in case folks want to learn more. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to move fast. So hang on and we'll get to the end here. So the Transmission Facilitation Program will have 3 different mechanisms: capacity contract, public-private partnership, and loans. The capacity contracts is the first solicitation, will be only for capacity contracts. The other 2 will roll out later. So there's not great details on the second 2. What I can tell you about the public-private partnerships, the one interesting note I saw was that it mentioned that because DOE is participating, that there is an ability to bypass the NEPA process. I didn't understand it well. There was a couple sentences about it in the small description of the P3 in the NOAA, so I'd definitely go take a look to learn more. The loans currently will be run a lot like the Loans Program Office, and again, they're still developing guidance. For capacity contracts, DOE can serve as an anchor tenant on new and upgraded transmission lines by buying up to 50% of the planned commercial capacity for up to 40 years. We can even give you some more information. So, I think the idea here is basically DOE can participate in these projects and be a partner when, if there's not an entity that can take that on. So there's a lot of what I can only imagine is very high level and ambiguous detail for folks that are experts in transmission planning in the NOAA. So I'm not going to try to speak over my skis here, but you can take a look at this information and just know that they're going to be doing a capacity contract workshop through DOE in August. So I think that they're really still trying to get a lot more details. They're also getting requests for information responses are due in June 13th on Monday. And so hopefully with that information, with those questions and response to how these programs are being set up at a very high level, they'll be able to provide more information. Eligible entities are as follows. So, both all types of utilities, independent transmission project developers, states, tribes, and other government entities. So a lot, a lot of people are eligible entities. I think the big note here is, of course, that states are eligible entities. That's interesting. I don't quite know what it means, but it'll be interesting to think about. And, just that with this broad opportunity, it means that there's just a lot of possibilities based on those 3 different mechanisms. So there are a lot of different ways that this can happen. So eligible projects must include construction of a new replacement transmission, upgrade, or connection of isolated microgrids. I don't think the 3rd one applies as much to Washington, so I think that's really, more about islanded communities. So really focusing on the first 2, that helps us kind of just get a sense of what we're talking about. So this is just the very basic high level. And of course, I made the mistake of putting all my notes in the notes that I can't see, but there's more details about these in terms of what else you need to include, some kind of principles from DOE. Oh, I did include them, pardon me. So you have to be able to enhance capacity, efficiency, and resilience. So really focusing on that resilience and reliability piece. And so many of the DOE IIJA programs focus on resilience, I'll say. I think DOE is really trying to understand how to create metrics around resilience. And for utilities in Washington State, that's really relevant, especially for CETA compliance, I think, given that it's one of the ways that an indicator you can use for equitable distribution of benefits. So kind of an interesting note there. Facilitate interregional transfer capacity. So, you're wanting that increases economic growth. So really being able to, some of those lines out of the state in that CAISO report, right? Where are you being able to bring in transmission that's actually going to increase economic growth in different regions? How are you actually bolstering that? And then good note that you also, there's also an aspect of lowering greenhouse gas emissions that is part of this consideration. So obviously that really lines up with Washington State and our region well. Interestingly, DOE did not have a slide on this, so I wanted to pull it out of the notice of intent. There are also equity and labor requirements. So, that you need to do community engagement, you need to, there will be these principles around equity, environment, and energy justice, IIJA, if you see that acronym, that will need to be part of projects. You'll have to incorporate EJ principles that will line up with Justice 40, which is the federal environmental justice initiative from the Biden-Harris administration. And then also that you'll need to support good paying union jobs and hybrid workforce development. So whatever project you have, as I'm understanding it, you need to be able to show that you're going to create a union workforce and incorporate things like project labor agreements and community benefit agreements into those contracts and things. So it's named, it's not named, the details are not much more than that though, but I wanted to make sure folks knew about that. Okay, so as I mentioned, DOE is phasing this in. So they're planning a phased approach for the solicitations. They say, if all goes as planned, starting in 2022 for capacity contracts. And then the second phase would include all 3 mechanisms later in 2023. And then the projects would have to be completed for this first phase by the end of 2027. I suspect, without knowing, that those timelines will get pushed back a little after they get those RFI responses in, but who knows, they could continue if they have enough specifics on projects that would be ready to go. Part of the RFI is asking about which projects would be ready to go for this solicitation. So I think they're trying to get a sense of that. So if you're interested, the request for information is looking at these topics and it's due on Monday. Basically, what do you think about the sequencing? How do you think about the review? So there's, again, if you go look at the details and the notice of intent, there's quite a lot that they're asking for in terms of, information about the project. So I can say a little bit more about that, pardon me. For example, how does it line up with regional long-term transmission planning? How does it, you have to show that by getting this funding, it would be addressing barriers that you wouldn't be able to address without the funding. So you have to be able to baseline, like, what the project would be and how it would be facilitated by this funding. And then there's a bunch of kind of points about that in there. You have to show that it's supporting all of the principles that were on the previous slide that DOE has about transmission facilitation planning. So, you know, just a lot there to consider and see if that's reasonable. First of all, I guess is what they're asking, but you know, are there things they're not considering? Do you need more details to understand what they're asking? I'm sure there's a lot of those types of questions. Yes, and then I think the other big one, and it really dovetails with what Arnie was talking about, is, you know, how DOE will measure the benefits of proposed projects. And this goes into like the costs of the projects, right? And it also dovetails with the FERC NOPR. I will not even pretend to have read 450 pages of FERC NOPR to feel like I can speak eloquently about how those things intersect, but how you cost out and measure benefits and you know how states are thinking about that based on their laws is really going to be important. Yeah, and then just kind of the more administrative and legalistic aspects of the contracts themselves. So again, next steps, there was a public webinar, you can see the slides. RFI comments due, a technical conference on capacity contracts in August. September 2022 is theoretically when they're releasing the phase 1 solicitations for the capacity contracts only, but keep your eyes open. After the RFI response, they might again change these timelines. So I'm actually going to pause there. I know I don't have a ton of time left and I might have actually already gone over it. I'm just going to put these questions up for us to look at, and I'll just read them. This is the kind of thing I'm considering in my role, and I don't have answers to. So if someone can answer all these questions, that's great, because you've done my job for me. But when I look through this solicitation, I think of these questions. The top two, I'd actually be most curious if folks could put in the chat or follow up with me. If you are planning to submit an RFI response, and if you are considering or feel like you might be eligible for a first phase project, I'd be very interested to know, you know, who's doing that in the state. And then otherwise, just thinking about the next phases of this revolving fund. So it's a $2.5 billion revolving fund. So we're going to have some time here. You know, who's the point person or entity in the state for coordination? Kind of goes to exactly this principle you all are trying to figure out. What is the opportunity for Washington with this program, right? Like, looking at this, I just don't know like how I'd answer a question like, how would this funding help overcome barriers, and how would we think about that? And really, what could the impact be for Washington? And so to answer that, you know, what planning needs to happen in advance of future applications? And then really, again, hitting on these 3 points that I think for me are really deeply a part of my role. You know, how does the state ensure tribal entities are involved early and consulted often on any kind of developing project? How do we best engage labor early to plan for workforce development? You know, these are huge undertakings that I'm sure require a lot of new different kinds of certifications and trainings. How do we ensure we have a pipeline of workforce ready to go for what the state needs to do? And how do we ensure an equitable and transparent process? So just kind of end, I'll just leave this slide up and can take questions, but my thoughts very much in line, I feel like, with what Arnie was saying and actually what you all are discussing today. You know, just being able to appoint a transmission planning lead for the state or a point person to coordinate with all the other entities that is a state agency person, developing a transmission planning roadmap. And so I actually, you know, had the CAISO 20-year transmission outlook in mind, as well as the PJM regional transmission expansion plan. Again, those are being done in, you know, organized markets. So we'd have to think about how to adopt this for Washington, but lots of good information in there. And then just continuing to follow the FERC NOPR on transmission planning and cost allocation. So that'll be, comments for that are going to be due in August, I believe. So I believe they got pushed back a bit. So we have some time there. And with that, I'll stop and hand it back to Rob. Thanks for your time today.
Sarah, thank you. There's a question that came in. Is the state planning on submitting any information as part of the RFI?
I am not aware of anybody that is currently doing that. If a state agency, state person is interested in doing that, I know we have a short window, but I'm happy to help make that happen. So I'd love someone to get in touch if we do want to do something.
Okay.
yeah, I wasn't quite clear if it was what we had to say at this point. So just trying to learn.
Okay, so this is what I'd like to do. It feels to me as if any questions that folks might have for Sara might bleed into the conversation we plan to have following the two presentations. So I just want to allow that bleed to happen. And so I want to see if folks have any questions for Sara about what she did, any reflections on the set of presentations. And so I'm really interested in having folks begin sharing with one another what they're seeing and what they're hearing. Before I do that, I want to tell you two things. The first is Susan is going to be working behind the scenes to in real time try to listen to what folks are saying and see if there is some conversions of thoughts around things to be drafting like principal language for us to take a look at. So we're in a funny stage where we have to build the plane and fly it since it's meeting 6. And so we're all building it and flying it together. And Susan's going to be trying to actively listen and pull content from the existing report if that exists, so that we can come back to you if it's appropriate today or tomorrow with specific suggestions for how we might augment the existing content. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there are 2 principles in the existing document that directly relate to this. There's a principle that talks about an RTO, and then there's a principle that is generic that talks about the need to expand regional coordination that I do think we have the opportunity to go deeper on if folks are interested. So that's the process that we're going to be doing behind the scenes, where we're at with the document. So what I'd like to do now is, in the next 25 or 30 minutes, I want to hear from folks. See if folks have questions. Sara, where are you at? What popped out in your head as you heard those conversations? What do you think is the right thing for Washington State to do? What do you think should be in our report around it? Yeah, Katie, please jump in.
Thanks, Rob. Before we get into the language of the document and recommendations we want to see, I appreciate the conversation Sara has started here, and I know that deadline is looming. But before we move on from this funding conversation, I wanted to ask Sara if she's tracking the Smart Grid Investment Grant Program, which is also led by the U.S. Department of Energy and is more focused on like reliability elements, would be more appropriate for like grid enhancing technologies, non-wires alternative type things. And I know I think that application period is open. I might be wrong, but correct me if I'm wrong, Sara, but approximately $3 billion would be available from 2022 to 2026 for this program as part of that Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And a 50% match is required there as well. So curious if Sara is tracking that, and if so, if she has any idea around deadlines and whatnot.
Thanks, Katie, for the question. Yeah, so the program, and I have all my notes in this board over here, so pardon me, I'm gonna look away. You're talking about the competitive grant program for upgrading our electric grid and ensuring reliability and resilience. So yeah, that's a $5 billion competitive grant, $1 billion a year for the next 5 years. It does all the things you say. Eligible entities are states or collections of states, tribes, local governments, and PUCs. That program is not currently open, and there has not been any solicitation as far as I know. If anyone has seen one, please let me know. I will drop in the chat. So I dropped in the specific thing for the transmission facilitation program. The next link I just put in is a clearinghouse where DOE puts up every single solicitation or any new information about the IIJA program. So this is something I check daily. And so I was just double checking about the smart grid grants. I believe more information about those is coming out in the next couple of months, Katie. So definitely tracking, be very curious to see the design of the program, because it has some interesting requirements that I've heard whispered of, but I haven't actually seen on paper. So I'll let you know. And then just so you know, that part of the kind of grid resilience package also includes the money, the formula grant money that I mentioned, that's for states and tribes. So all states and all federally recognized tribes will have an allocation formula that allows them access to some amount of money that is specifically for grid resilience measures, building actual things like underground wires and substations. Also includes funding for workforce development. It requires writing a plan and holding a public hearing. The timeline for that is theoretically, the program will have information starting July 1st, and then states and tribes will have 60 days to create a plan and do a public hearing. I believe there will be a lot of pushback on that, and so we're hoping to get a 6-month extension on that. But that is a formula program that will address the same thing, and then there will be these competitive competitive programs that will sort of complement. And then the other one is another competitive program that will be more focused on industry, and that's an extension of the old smart grid program under IIJA, and that will be $3 billion or $600 million a year for 5 years. And that is also going to be an interesting one. That will be for utilities, but you'll have to show that you've done, it's kind of based on work that you've done in the past around resilience measures. So again, some interesting murmurings about the requirements of those programs. Are really waiting for more information from DOE, which is not coming as fast as all of us would like. So hopefully that answers your question. But if you do find anything, Katie, that I've missed, please don't hesitate to send it to me.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Sarah. So 2 questions in the chat having to do specifically with that last slide you put up. The first question was on the recommendation of transmission planning lead from the state. Are there discussions going on, like in the energy office or the governor's office, about where that person would live and what their portfolio would look like? And then the second part of that question is on the second one about developing a transmission roadmap. Are you aware of any discussions within the state that are underway? And then any ideas you have of, who would be at the table, where does the table live, about the implementation of it?
And here, Stu, I thought you were going to have the answer to those questions for me. So, those are great questions that I think need discussing, and I hope that is what will come out of this conversation y'all are having today. My feeling is I think there's a pretty good design in how this could be done that happened with the hydrogen work. So, the governor appointed our director, Lisa Brown, to be in charge of kind of figuring out what we want to do about hydrogen and how we could create a roadmap and figure out how to apply for a federal program for hydrogen hubs. So Commerce has, been working across a lot of different entities to also create this nonprofit organization called the Pacific Northwest Hydrogen Association that will be the entity that applies for that federal funding. Now, that last part with the kind of the 501c3, that doesn't need to be part of this conversation, but I think the model of having the governor be able to appoint a person to figure out a point person or figure out a point person, to me seems like a good method, just to, really ensure some clarity, or at least a process to clarity. So at that table, I imagine would be, the state agency family, because for me, this entity is, it's not necessarily the lead person making all the decisions on transmission planning, but it's the lead state entity to help coordinate on all of these things that have really ambiguous, kind of jurisdictional issues. Because when it's very diffuse, I imagine that can be very hard to know how to actually make decisions sometimes. So that was my thinking there. And know from what I know, other than kind of whatever is happening in this room here, there's an analogous conversation around siting in the siting work group that we're doing across the road here. So, I think, and I just mean virtual road because it's on the next meeting on my calendar. And, in there, the question is similar. We don't necessarily have, with respect to clean energy, kind of an heir apparent for, who the point person is for siting clean energy projects in the state. We have new jurisdiction that FSTEC has, and they're building, as they're becoming their own agency. We have, a lot of new need and a lot of interest. We just got a lot happening. So, really trying to think about across the state agency family, how do we decide, how do we make decisions? I think it's a real question, right? And so again, it need not be the point person or one entity, perhaps it's a group of people or a body of people, given the complexity and cross-cutting nature of these things. But I imagine that, and I think Diane Buderek is also on this group, right, that there is a lot of analogous need there. So perhaps a conversation between those two groups too, to understand, how they might work together and not duplicate efforts. And then Stu, to your second question, it's very similar. I don't know that there is any specific conversation happening. Other folks from utilities have sent me, these plans and said, hey, it would be great if there was a roadmap like this for Washington. So Uzma Siddiqui, I think a lot of you probably know, who's just a really good thought partner on these things, had noticed the PJM work and thought, wow, this could be something that would be really useful for Washington State. And so I think, just thinking about, though, not in an ISO, like what would we actually need to solve for, and how you do a 20-year outlook in our region. Are we going to be doing kind of that geographical block aspect the way California did it? Is it more just kind of a laundry list of what you need to meet future load based on our scenarios that we have for clean energy? Is it a process to understand how to coordinate around some of those regulatory issues? It could be a lot of things. And so I think there's a good way to start with those two.